Hello everyone and welcome to the repair log video on the angry video game nerd's Nintoaster, which has finally been reintroduced in the latest episode named The Legend of Kage. In case you weren't aware, the console had broken a couple of years back, and around 1 year ago I got the chance to work on it, not only fixing it but also doing an HDMI mod to it in the process. Since the initial build of the console has already been more or less documented, I figured I might as well go ahead and record the entire fixing process too. And since the Nintoaster had its epic comeback to the series just recently, it's really about time I finally make this video. But first, a quick message to my German viewers. I've decided to record this video in English rather than German, since I expect the audience for this one to be mostly English speaking. However, I will make sure to either provide German subtitles or make another version with German voiceover in the future, so everyone is at least kind of happy. Also, I know this is a bit of an unusual video, but this story is simply too good not to share. And with that being said, let's get into the video. To start off, let me just give you a brief summary on what happened. About a year ago, I stumbled upon the AVGN wiki, which is a website run by fans trying to gather as much information about the series in one place as possible. So, while I was looking around, I eventually ended up on the Nintoaster's page, which quoted a tweet from James in the section named The Death of the Nintoaster, stating it had fried a long time ago. Now at the time, I wasn't actually aware of this at all. Even though I was frequently watching the newer nerd episodes when they came out, I didn't think too much of him not using the Nintoaster anymore. But now that I've read it, it suddenly became quite clear to me why that was the case. But still, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm pretty sure everyone who's going to watch this knows what we're talking about here, but just in case it's not correct, here's some context. The Nintoaster is essentially a case-modded Nintendo Entertainment System, the US version of which released in 1986. And apparently, the fact that NES games kind of resemble a slice of toast was enough of a reason for this guy named Richard Dalutz to decide it would be a brilliant idea to simply take an NES and stick it inside a toaster. When he eventually unveiled his creation, people loved the idea, and thus he made a second one, documented the build process on YouTube, and sent the actual console to the AVGN, since he already had the first Nintoaster he built for himself and didn't need a second one. It had made its first appearance in the episode named Action 52, released in July of 2011, and has been part of the series ever since until it eventually broke. James then replaced it with an AVS, which is a high-quality NES clone system capable of outputting video through HDMI instead of AV, dramatically increasing audio and, more importantly, video quality. Needless to say, over the years, the Nintoaster has become one of the most recognizable game consoles in gaming history. Naturally, I was quite upset about the news, so I dug up the original tweet and had a look through the thread. People were sad, just like I was, but that was about it. That's when I figured, why not send James an email offering to fix the console for him? I already had some experience in this niche since I actually made my own Nintoaster a while back, and I have generally tinkered with a few NES consoles before, so I might just be able to get it working again. The idea did sound pretty crazy in my head, but I figured I might as well just do it. It's not like I had anything to lose. Shortly after, I sent him an email with my offer, confident I wouldn't hear back anyway. However, once I had almost forgotten about the entire thing already, he proved me wrong. Eight emails and the time it takes to ship a package from the US to Germany later, I had this beautiful console on my desk. So, let's take a look at what's going on. Now, as a quick disclaimer, please note that I'm in no way whatsoever an expert on anything I will be doing in this video. I'm literally just a 17-year-old fiddling with a soldering iron in his excuse for a workshop, so I wouldn't recommend taking anything I do as an example on how to do something right. If anything, it's an example on how to do it wrong. But then again, we're talking about fixing an NES built into the shell of a toaster here, so that being considered, does a right way even exist? Anyway, let's get started for real. The first thing I could notice immediately was that unfortunately there was some shipping damage. The AV connectors have come loose and fallen inside the console. This shouldn't be big of a problem since it can just be glued back into place. The more upsetting part is that a piece of the foot has broken off on one corner. Of course this can be glued back on too, but the spot it snapped off at will remain slightly visible. With the console now unboxed, the first order of business is to hook it up and take a look at what problems we're having. So, to quote the nerd himself, let's plug this sucker in and, well, bullshit. Now, if you've ever been to a few countries before, chances are you've noticed the different plug outlets depending on where you are. Here's a map of that just to show how ridiculous it can get. The nerd lives in the US. They use the Type A outlet there, while we use Type F and C outlets here in Germany. To make matters even worse, the outlet voltage in the US is 120 volts, while it's almost double in Europe. So not only doesn't it fit in the outlet, the power supply inside was built to handle a different voltage than what I can supply to. That means in order to test the console at all, I would need to solder on a European power supply. So to do that, let's get this thing opened up. While fiddling around with the case trying to see how I can get it off, I noticed a hatch on the underside. I'm assuming this is where you would usually remove breadcrumbs that have fallen into the toaster, but since this thing can't toast bread anymore, it doesn't really serve a purpose. So I open it up and damn, look, that's pretty interesting. Apparently, Richard, the guy who originally made the console, put a signature here. Remember, he actually documented the process of him making this very console, but this specific detail has never been mentioned in his or any other video, so I really felt like I'd discovered something here. But for real now, let's disassemble this thing. It was actually much more of a nightmare than I originally thought it would be. At first I had some trouble getting the black side panels off, but that was really just due to my own stupidity, since I didn't see that there was another screw further up on each panel hidden in a hole right above the handle. The real trouble, however, started when I tried to get off the chrome casing. It doesn't seem like a big task, just loosen the screws on the underside, get the plastic caps off the lever and the knob for heating adjustment, and simply take it off. However, I could, for the life of me, not get that damn knob off of there. I gave it my best effort, but no matter how much force I used, it just didn't move at all. Not wanting to damage anything, I even looked up the original build video, which did show the plastic knob being off, but I couldn't figure out how he did it. I eventually settled to just work with what I currently can for now and figure out the knob problem later. I started by removing the tons of hot glue on the side, where the power supply and the 7805 power regulator are mounted, which I can luckily access. After taking the power supply from another unit I was currently testing, I soldered the ground wire directly to the corresponding pin of the 7805 and the 9V DC wire to the cable running through the lever switch of the toaster. Now I know this contraption doesn't look particularly safe, but come on, sketchy situations require sketchy solutions. I plugged it in for the very first time afterwards and to my surprise, everything seemed to work. James did say the console wasn't entirely broken, but he had trouble with fading video and audio signals, noise, distortion and issues of similar nature. Now, when I went to test it a second time, I finally noticed some problems, namely severe distortion of the audio and video signals. It always seemed to happen when I wiggled the AV ports around, which were still loose at that time. Since the console itself seemed to work just fine, I figured the problem was probably a bad video signal. And I'll just leave the diagnosis to Richard himself.
Many bad video signal problems stem from improper grounding.
Thank you. So, let's check whether ground is consistently present on the AV ports, shall we? The results were about as expected. While I did measure a short to ground sometimes, it wasn't particularly consistent and could very well be the cause of the distortions that I had seen earlier. Luckily, this is a very easy fix, and thus I decided it would definitely be worth giving it a try. Half a roll of solder later, I deemed the connection to be sufficient and went ahead to test whether our issues persisted. And the answer is, perhaps surprisingly, no. No matter how much I jiggled the ports around, there were no distortions to speak of anymore. So that means we're done here, right? Well, not quite. It was around this time I suggested to James via email that we could try doing a high-def mod to the console. In case you don't really know what I'm talking about here, allow me to once again give you a quick summary. The video quality that a console outputs is always important. However, it is especially true for the NES, because the quality you get from the AV or RF jacks in the original console are unimpressive, to put it nicely. Since James needs to record gameplay footage for his nerd episodes, this becomes even more of a concern than it would usually be. Luckily, there is a few methods to improve video quality on the NES. Disregarding emulation, the following 3 methods are the most viable and common: external upscaling, clone hardware, and internal mods. The first option is the easiest and often also the cheapest. The video signal from the console is run through one of the many available types of converter boxes out there, and depending on which one you decided to use, the video quality may increase. Clone hardware, on the other hand, is a little more expensive, but worth it if you choose a high quality product. Basically, you ditch your original NES entirely and play your cartridges on this new device instead, which functions almost identically to the original. However, it's built to natively output a crisp digital HDMI signal. As mentioned earlier, this is what the nerd has been doing for the NES reviews lately, in his case running in AVS, which is one of the best clone systems available. The best option in my opinion, however, has got to be an internal mod, specifically the high-def NES. With an internal mod, you solder additional hardware to your original NES, which in the case of the high-def NES kit grabs data directly from the CPU and PPU chips on the mainboard and converts it to a flawless digital HDMI signal internally. The console will remain almost the same on the outside, the only addition being an HDMI port on the back. Now, these kits were obviously built for installation in the original NES shell. Fitting everything into the toaster would be very difficult, but I felt like it was something I could make work. The big advantage of doing this would be that James could use the toaster for recording his nerd episodes again, since the high-def kit delivers video quality which is at least on par with the AVS, while also offering lots of configuration options to make it look good on almost any display you choose. While waiting for his reply on the idea, I finished up everything else that I currently could. Glued the AV jacks that had fallen out in shipping back into place with some nice component adhesive, took off my jerry-rigged power supply, reattached the internal one, and of course made sure to give the entire console, which was actually quite dirty, a good clean. Not long after, I got green light from James to do the HDMI mod. So I went ahead to order the high-def kit from GameTech US and started preparing the console while I wait for it to arrive. That meant back to square one, trying to get the damn casing off the toaster. This time I had a new plan. Instead of trying to remove the plastic knob off the heat dial, I noticed I could unscrew the entire module from below and lift it off with the casing. With that plan in mind, I freed and desoldered some wires on the side I had access to, unscrewed the heat dial module and managed to finally lift the shell off the frame. While doing so, the reset button had come loose, so I disconnected it for the time being. The next step was to free the mainboard so I could get to work desoldering the CPU and PPU. Luckily, the adhesive he generously used to secure it in place had aged quite a bit and in consequence was very easy to remove. Now to the hard part, desoldering the CPU and PPU chips. This took me half an eternity. I don't have particularly fancy tools for desoldering stuff, so I had no choice but to spend ages fiddling around with my small manual spring-loaded soldering pump and solder rig, trying to get each and every pin loose. The CPU eventually came out without too many complications. The PPU, however, took much longer for some reason. It just didn't want to move at all. After hours, I finally got it out of there, and wow, I've really made a mess on the board there. I cleaned it up, took a break, and went to sleep. A few days later, the high-def kit arrived, and I was able to start installing the mod. Now we can really get going here. However, getting this build is going to be a little different from an installation in a normal NES shell. These tiny PCBs are supposed to sit between the chip and the mainboard. However, we're not going to have enough room for installing it this way. It would end up way too tall. So, I had no choice but to improvise a little. The plan was to move the chips and sockets away from the board by simply soldering strands of wires in between. So I started by soldering the sockets to some perf board. I am aware that it's not particularly good practice to add wires between important chips and the mainboard because of the increased latency, but since the NES isn't all that powerful and complex, there shouldn't be any noticeable problems. After that, it was time to prepare the small PCBs that layer in between the mainboards and chips. That procedure was very much the same as with a normal high-def NES install. Since the high-def board also takes over power regulation, the original 7805 regulator needed to go. It was conveniently mounted on a small screw sticking out of the frame, so all that needed to be done was desoldering it and attaching the power wires coming from the high-def board in its place. Since we want the toaster to still be able to output AV alongside HDMI, I also had to desolder another transistor on the board and jump the contacts it sat in with a piece of solid wire, as described in the mod instructions. With all of the usual high-def stuff done, it was time to start wiring up the chip sockets to the mainboard. The process itself isn't that hard. I simply cut up some old IDE hard drive cables, divided them into equal parts, stripped the ends and soldered them to the board, then the sockets. But let me tell you, this process takes forever. It's comparable to connecting the cartridge slot to the mainboard. Not hard, but tedious. Now that everything is wired up, I put the chips into their respective sockets and started preparing the console for its first HDMI test. Reconnecting the reset button, power wires, and soldering on a spare NES power button, since with the lid taken off we can't use the toaster lever. I did, however, need the case laying next to the frame in order to connect the heat dial for the LEDs and the AV jacks. With the last order of business, plugging in the ribbon cables connecting the two chip PCBs and the high-def board complete, it was finally time to test. While I was doing all the modding work, I had ordered a wall socket adapter that will let me plug the console into my European outlet. Note that it has an active voltage converter inside of it, which most common adapters don't. So, let's, for real this time, plug this sucker in and here we go. Damn it! Nothing on HDMI and only a grey screen on AV. Something had clearly gone wrong. I once again decided to sleep over it and continue the next day. So the next day I plugged it in once more and suddenly that's right, it works! And we don't only have AV back, but HDMI too. Now, with the system itself in working order, it was time to move into the final phase of the project, assembly. First order of business, take everything back apart and do some cleanup work. With the high-def board taken off and the power wires cut, I continued to remove the heatsink from the chassis. It was originally put in to handle the considerable heat output from the 7805 power regulator, but since we've entirely gotten rid of that thing, there is no point in keeping it. The much newer power regulator on the high-def board is a lot more efficient and shouldn't cause any temperature problems. The thin wiring for the reset button didn't look that durable anymore, so I decided to put some hot glue over it to prevent any further damage to the solder points. Now for the final tedious part, getting the two main chips we currently have dangling off the board somewhere permanent. And that means after I trimmed the perf board a little around the edges, I had to once again undo all wiring leading to the chip sockets in order to extend one of them, because I couldn't get both of them into the spot on the bottom of the system that I wanted them to sit in. Luckily, the other one was barely long enough. With all the wiring finalized, I put a protective layer of hot glue over it, so these sensitive parts wouldn't bend, short out or get damaged in any other way. Now that they're safe to handle, I routed the cables where they needed to go and glued them in place so they wouldn't wobble about while I was trying to fix the actual sockets to the frame. While that has worked well for one of the chips, I couldn't find a good spot to secure the other one to. So I decided to prepare a small piece of bent plastic that was originally part of a microwave, which I glued to the frame to act as a support for the second socket. Some component glue, hot glue and sleep later, I had it in place. However, as expected, it didn't look particularly stable, so I prepared a piece of metal, which was originally part of another toaster I'm modding, to go underneath the socket and act as sort of a platform for it to rest on. The hot glue I used to adhere came loose again not long after, so I eventually settled on using component glue, which got the job done. Before finishing up the other parts of the inside though, I decided it was time to drill the hole for the HDMI port into the casing. Now, looking back at how I did this, I have to say I should have definitely approached this part with a little more care, but oh well. It's not like I can change anything about that anymore. So here's how it went. After measuring where the HDMI port needed to go, my brother joined me in drilling a hole as a starting point. A small handheld drill would have probably been sufficient, but oh well, the drill press it is. With the hole in place, I went on to make the first big mistake. I didn't put it in a vise to secure it for filing out the hole, but just got my brother to hold it instead. You can probably already see it coming. I eventually slipped with the file and caused a considerable scratch. Luckily it's on the backside and thus won't be visible in most cases. But James was nice enough to proudly present it in the debut episode, so that's a plus. But because that wasn't enough, I immediately went on to make the second mistake, putting it in a vise. While it did hold the casing in place very well, it actually caused a tiny dent in the top left corner, despite me layering some felt in between the vise and the case to protect it. But hey, at least the hole turned out pretty decent. That being said, I went on to glue an HDMI port into the freshly cut hole, which worked out alright, eventually. It's part of a modular, slim HDMI extension that I'm going to use to connect it to the high-def board. Speaking of which, I taped off one side so I can glue it to the frame without damaging it. Having done that, I adhered it using component glue, which is always a good choice when something really needs to stay in place. After removing the 3.7 megatons of old epoxy that used to hold the mainboard in place, I did the very same thing to it, except for the tape of course. In order to properly route the HDMI extension ribbon, I decided it would be best to remove a small piece of steel from the frame to make room for it. So I whipped out the Dremel and went to town. Of course, without securing anything or covering up the electronic components near it, because what could go wrong? Turns out a lot could go wrong, but luckily nothing did. Next up, I properly isolated the main power cables coming directly from the wall socket, which I have totally been shocked by once or twice while working on this, so it was about time. Just as a friendly reminder, it's not exactly pleasant to either stick a fork into the wall socket or alternatively touch these two cables together with your fingers. So please don't try that at home, alright? With this immediate threat finally neutralized, I spent the next few eternities tidying up all the other wires running through the system. I even went as far as installing a cable tie or two, which I'd say definitely elevated this project from amateur to professional level. I then ran the HDMI extension ribbon along the spot I prepared earlier, fixed it in place with some ISO tape and then connected it to the port on the casing, bringing us to the last, truly difficult step of this build project, the relidding. It sounds very dramatic, but I pretty much just stuffed the frame back into the case just the way it had originally sat, while praying for nothing to break. And surprisingly, that worked! After soldering the heat dial back on, connecting the ports and isolating the solder joints, the lid was back in place. I was so close to screwing on the last side panel when disaster struck. It didn't fit anymore. It seems like I had glued on the mainboard a bit far to one side, which however ultimately ended up saving me because otherwise the HDMI port on the other side would not have fit anymore. So what to do? I noticed the plastic panel being quite thick, so I figured it might be a good idea to whip out the good old Dremel again and just carve some material out, which hopefully would be just enough to make it fit. After scrubbing away at the plastic for much longer than I probably should have, I did not only eventually manage to make it fit, but also get severe lung cancer from this horrific dust. Seriously, that stuff is nothing to mess with. Anyway, to give myself just a little more wiggle room, I slightly trimmed down the old front panel port, lined the panel up, and put the final few screws back into place. What a magical moment. Now finally, after this absolute adventure of a project, I was left with something that really made it worth all this effort. Not only had I managed to fix the console, but now it's also equipped with the best high def the current market has to offer. Before I sign off, I'd like to thank James for his amazing work on not just the Nerd series, but on all his other projects too. And of course, for giving me the opportunity to work on this famous console in order to preserve a piece of AVGN tradition. I wish you the best of luck with it for many more episodes, and I hope it won't cause any trouble. Well, that about wraps it up. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like or even consider subscribing, but most importantly, I'd be delighted to see some feedback in the comment section. Depending on how viewer reception will be like, I might make more content like this in the future. For now though, thanks so much for watching and take care. Bye!